Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, as far as I can tell, Joe Biden is still president. The day-to-day coverage doesn't always reflect that, but I think that's still the case.
Yeah, there's only like 62 days left in the Trump show, so I guess the coverage is getting the very last drops of the Trump reality show before we all move on.
Yeah, you got to milk that. Unfortunately, we are also doing the same thing today because there's a lot of kind of weird news out of the Trump White House that we should cover when it comes to foreign policy.
He's still the president. Unfortunately.
Yeah, he's still got a lot of power for a couple of days. So the first thing we're going to talk about is reports that Trump is looking for options to bomb Iran. Don't love that. The other thing we'll get into is reports that he's looking to accelerate the drawdown of troops from various places across the globe. We'll dig into the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia and the scary ways it is expanding in the Horn of Africa. Reports that the Al-Qaeda number 2 is dead and was assassinated in Iran by Israeli-linked gunmen, I guess. I don't know. We'll dig into that one. Talk about what's happening in Peru. We'll talk about China's new trade deal that sounds a lot like an old Obama trade deal. The latest in Hong Kong, a bit on the transition. And then the interview today is great. I talked to Ruwaida Abdulaziz. She covers Islamophobia, social justice, and national security at HuffPost. We talked about some really interesting reporting that this app, Ben, called Muslim Pro, that's been downloaded by like 100 million people, was selling its data to data brokers that then went on and resold it to like security contractors, including U.S. Special Operations Command. So you can imagine how upsetting that was for a lot of people, and a whole bunch of stuff. By the way, actually, Ayat Akhtar's novel inspired like half of my questions because it's just so good and so searing. So stick around for that. You will not want to miss the conversation. But Ben, unfortunately, I think we should start with this Bomb Iran piece because on Monday night, the New York Times posted a 5 byline story. That means 5 reporters worked on this. That said, last week, President Trump gathered his senior advisors in the Oval Office and he asked for military options to attack Iran's nuclear facilities in the coming weeks. So apparently this idea was too crazy even for the dead enders like Pompeo and the hacks that he recently installed on his national security team. And they warned correctly that this could escalate into a much broader war. And he doesn't want that on his legacy because I guess he's going to run again. The report said that Trump might still be looking for ways to attack Iranian assets or allies, including some in Iraq. This comes after the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, found that Iran had enriched enough uranium to make 2 nuclear bombs. It's important to note for listeners, it would still take months to actually make them, so don't be alarmed. But, that's the amount of material they have. Adding insult to injury, the Washington Post reported that recent satellite imagery found that Iran has successfully evaded sanctions and has been delivering petroleum products to Venezuela. So to sum it up, the maximum pressure strategy has completely failed. And now it appears that lame duck Donald wants to blow something up. So the White House is also reportedly very nervous about the anniversary of Qasem Soleimani's assassination on January 3rd. So, Ben, I'm hoping this all leaked out because someone briefed on that meeting wanted to prevent a missile strike from happening. But if Trump bombed Natanz or bombed Fordow, the 2 enrichment facilities, what do you think would happen? How far would it set back Iran's nuclear program? And what do you think the reaction could look like?
Well, yeah, I really look forward, Tommy, to talking about, criticizing, breaking down Joe Biden's efforts to pursue diplomacy with Iran because we've had this conversation. But
remember when you were attacked for saying that it was the JCPOA or war?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is this is the result of their failed policy. And what happened is you had a deal in place. Trump tore it up. And Iran, as the IAEA found, has significantly expanded its domestic enrichment activities because it's no longer abiding by the constraints of the deal that the U.S. violated. It's not that complicated. And I think Trump, on his way out of office, is presented with, the clear evidence of the complete and utter failure of his policy. It's hard to think of a policy that has failed more because Iran has
Except for North Korea.
Well, yeah, Iran has more nuclear material. They're more aggressive in the region. None of the problems have been solved, right? Look, if we bombed their facilities just on the nuclear side, when we looked at this, we assessed that you probably set back their nuclear capability like a year. Because they know how to do this. We can't destroy their knowledge of the nuclear fuel cycle. We can't kill all their scientists. We can't wipe out all of their infrastructure. We can blow up these 2 facilities. But I think if you blew up their nuclear programs, number one, it would guarantee that they're not going to do another nuclear deal and they're just going to try to dash out and covertly develop a nuclear weapon. But number two, it's likely to start a wider war across the Middle East. Iran could respond by attacking Saudi Arabia. Iran could respond by blowing up the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. There's any number of things that they could do. And this is the height of insanity to even consider this. Consider starting a war that could go on for years on your way out the door. I mean, it's even by the standards of Trump, this is about the most irresponsible and insane thing I could possibly think of any president doing on the way out the door. For what reason? Just so that he can, what? Just so he can say that he bombed them, just so that he can cover up for the failure of his own policy by making the situation even worse. I mean, this would be quadrupling down on something that has already left Joe Biden a problem that he shouldn't be having because it had already been solved.
Yeah, a total mess. You mentioned a bunch of places where we currently have troops. It's a good segue to the other big news, which is, we've talked about how Trump has basically decapitated the senior leadership at the Department of Defense. He didn't kill them, he fired them. But, there are lots of rumors and reports that he did so in part because he wanted to accelerate troop drawdowns. Today, the Pentagon made it official. So the new acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, announced that the U.S. will draw down troops in Iraq and Afghanistan to 2,500 troops in each country by the end of Trump's first and only term. Currently, we got 4,500 troops in Afghanistan and 3,000 in Iraq. The New York Times had reported that Trump would also withdraw the 700 troops doing training and counterterrorism in Somalia, but I don't think that was announced today. So for context, there have been countless reports over the last few years about how Trump is mad at DOD, at the Pentagon, for slowing down these troop withdrawals. And frankly, I think he has a point. There was a recent exit interview by a guy named James Jeffrey. He was the former special representative for Syria, where he was basically bragging that he lied to Trump and played shell games to keep more troops in Syria than Trump had ordered, which, I don't care what party you're in. I don't care how important you think the mission is or how self-important you are personally, or if you're the committee to protect America or whatever. It's just not acceptable to defy a presidential order about ending a war. But I digress. They didn't elect Jim Jeffrey. They elected Trump anyway. So this could be why Mark Esper was fired in part, the former SecDef. He reportedly told Trump that the conditions weren't safe enough for a withdrawal in Afghanistan. Already, we've seen several Republican members of Congress criticize this plan, including Mitch McConnell, who compared it to the U.S. departure from Saigon in 1975. Ben, maybe we should do these one at a time since they're totally different countries and situations. Maybe we start with Somalia. Again, it's been reported, but it wasn't announced, I don't think. I don't have a great handle on what that mission is at this point. I think it's counterterrorism against al-Shabaab and then training the Somali military. I think everyone agrees that al-Shabaab is a real threat, that we want the Somali government to have some sort of military capacity. The timing seems particularly bad given the civil war happening in Ethiopia next door, which we'll get to later. But what do you think about pulling those 700 guys out of Somalia?
Well, look, it's such a weird Trump thing because it actually wouldn't end the U.S. involvement militarily there. The drone base, right. Yeah, the drone bases would still be in place. The U.S. has troops in Djibouti, which is right there. And so, you'd be removing, he seems obsessed with troop numbers, but not looking at actually what the U.S. military is doing. I think taking out those 700 would reduce the capacity that we have to be training the types of security forces that you would want to be responsible for securing that area without diminishing what I think have been way too frequent use of U.S. drones that have caused civilian casualties, that have dramatically ticked up under Trump. So he's making it harder by pulling them out to be pursuing the solution of having security forces there taking the place of U.S. drone strikes that would continue. It's not, even if you think that we need to figure out a way to get ourselves out of the business of these counterterrorism operations in Somalia, this is just a very weird way of going about doing it that is only focused on hitting a certain number of troops removed from a particular area, but not addressing what the mission of the U.S. military is and whether that mission is too aggressive. And as you point out, Ethiopia, which has also been a part of supporting peacekeeping forces and supporting counterterrorism efforts in that area, is pulling its troops out at the same time. so you have this potential for this vacuum of support for the Somali security forces and support for the peacekeeping missions against al-Shabaab, the terrorist group there. Just so Trump can, I mean, is he really going to run for re-election in 2024 on the accomplishment of removing 700 troops from Somalia? It's kind of bizarre.
Seems unlikely. I found the Iraq decision similarly confusing. I mean, that government is incredibly unstable. The security situation in Iraq is apparently so bad that Mike Pompeo has threatened to withdraw all embassy personnel from our U.S. embassy in Baghdad, which is the size of the Vatican. It's like 100 plus acres. I guess this is just pulling out 500 guys and getting it from 3,000 to 2,500. But did you have a reaction to that decision? It seems similarly arbitrary to me.
It seems arbitrary, and it's what is the point? Because what you do is you look at the missions of the troops. What are they there to do? And some of them are there to protect the U.S. embassy and U.S. diplomats. Some of them are there to support counter-ISIS operations, which have largely been paused since the Qasem Soleimani assassination because it's so dangerous to conduct those operations. And some of them are there to help train or support the Iraqi security forces. Again, we don't know why they're picking this particular number. He's not going to zero, so he's not going to be able to say, I took all the troops out of Iraq. Yeah. What is the magic formula that led to this number? And in Iraq, if you remember, there's like 30 nations involved in a coalition there. None of those other nations seem to be consulted. Again, it just seems like either arbitrary so he can say he drew down forces, or maybe he doesn't care if things go off the rails in Iraq because that would make Joe Biden look bad. I mean, honestly, I think there's no limit to Trump's cynicism. So
a good point.
You actually might need to consider the reality that he's going to leave circumstances kind of almost deliberately more difficult for Biden. He gets to say, I drew down troops, and then he gets to blame Joe Biden when the ISIS problem gets worse because he's, provoked the Iranians and removed some of the U.S. troops there. Again, it seems totally bizarre.
Yeah, so that brings us to Afghanistan. And so, look, you and I have both talked many times about the fact that we think it's long past time for the U.S. to be out of Afghanistan. But there are also these ongoing peace talks between an Afghan group and the Taliban. And I guess the question is, would a fast withdrawal of 2,500 troops or so make that harder? Would it lead to a hasty NATO withdrawal? Because I think there's like 7,000 NATO forces there, but they basically rely on the U.S. military for logistics and often protection. Would that lead to chaos? You could see a redux of Obama in Iraq in 2014, end up sending troops back in. I mean, to your point about how to make it harder for Biden, this could be part of that.
Yeah, we've talked about the peace talks, right, that are going on between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Obviously, you and I have been pretty pessimistic about those. But this, again, drawing 2,500 troops out, not even taking all of them out, right? Again, why is it so important to Trump to have 2,500 instead of 4,500? In an action that is not coordinated with any of those NATO allies, that is not coordinated with the Afghan government, that is not factored into the peace negotiations. It is just something that he is doing through like a handful of Devin Nunes apparatchiks at the Pentagon in the last minutes of his administration. He had 4 years to get this done. If he wanted to get troops out of Afghanistan or get out of Iraq or out of Somalia, why is he doing this now? Why hasn't he been working on this for these 4 years? And people will hear me and say, well, what, you just want to keep all these troops in these places? No, but the question is, how do you remove troops? How do you end wars? And you do it by assessing what are we doing in this country? What are our missions? What security forces are we leaving this to? And what is the political and diplomatic context for what we're doing? And so, if Joe Biden wants to methodically go after this, it's change the legal authorities so that you're repealing that 2001 authorization of the use of military force that is totally open-ended. It's real diplomacy in Afghanistan to try to empower the Afghan government, coupled with really continued financial support for the Afghan security forces so that they can be the leading military force, and they already are, but even more so in holding ground against the Taliban. It's diplomacy within Afghanistan to bring in more of the Afghan people to this process, and it's diplomacy with the neighboring countries. And then, yes, then responsibly you can say, okay, we've arranged the pieces here so that we can take these troops out. You don't just yank them out in the middle of a process, a peace process and a NATO process that could then just implode because of this puzzle piece that you've removed. That's just not how you go about doing this. So what I actually worry about is he may actually, in a strange way, end up undermining the objective of removing troops from these places. Because by doing it hastily in a way that's not coordinated, in a way that's not competent, he's going to leave things much worse. And you're right, there's going to be pressure on a Joe Biden to send more troops back into Afghanistan, to send more troops back into Iraq because of the way that Trump did this. So it's totally irresponsible. And Tommy, I can't even see how it's politically that useful. He, again, in 2024, is he going to say I got troops to 2,500 instead of 4,500, so vote for me? What?
Yeah.
These are, yeah.
Petulant, capricious. I don't even get it. God, it would be so great if Biden could get the AOMF repealed, but it would, of course, require a bipartisan vote in the Senate, so it may be tough. Let's turn to Ethiopia, because the civil war in Ethiopia is really spiraling, and it's now drawn in neighboring Eritrea and Sudan. And the conflict could really destabilize the entire Horn of Africa. So in an interview on Sunday with the Associated Press, the president of Ethiopia's Tigray region, which is that small northern province, it's got 5 or 6 million people, he said that his forces had fired missiles into Eritrea, the neighboring country, in response to Eritrea sending troops into Tigray. So it sounds like, you have Eritrean troops crossing the border into Ethiopia now, which is frightening. So it's not just an internal civil war, it's this regional thing now. We've talked about how the conflict keeps getting worse. The genesis of it was the Ethiopian government, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, claimed that rebel forces in Tigray attacked a federal military base in Tigray on November 4th. In response, he sent troops north into the region, and they've been doing this sort of clearing operation ever since, and they keep announcing that they've taken another town. So there's seemingly some pretty intense fighting. The genesis of it is not quite that simple. The prime minister came to power in 2018. In the process, he sidelined a bunch of the old rebel leaders and strongmen who had fought through the 70s and the 80s and who had deposed a really hated dictator in Ethiopia back in 1991. So there's a lot of history there and some bad blood. But, this news shocked the world because Prime Minister Ahmed had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to broker a peace deal with Eritrea just recently. So the African Union, which is based in Ethiopia, is reportedly pushing for a ceasefire. It's been rejected by the Prime Minister, reportedly. There's also reports that up to 25,000 Ethiopians have crossed over into Sudan to flee the fighting. Ben, I think you mentioned this last week. The UAE has significant military presences in Eritrea, and there's reports that their drones are hitting targets in Tigray. So all the communications into the region have been cut off, so we don't really know for sure. Ben, I just couldn't be more worried about how badly this seems to be spiraling. As far as I can tell, there is zero engagement by the Trump administration to try to mediate in any way, despite Ethiopia being, by far our most important ally in the region. I mean, what do you make of the latest, and what do you think Biden should be preparing to do, I guess?
Well, right now it feels like the whole situation is going off the rails in ways that would be incredibly damaging to Ethiopia. It would lead to a civil war, humanitarian consequences. It could spill into Eritrea, as you said. It could create kind of ripple effects across the Horn of Africa as Ethiopia moves its forces out of the Horn of Africa. And it's going to lead, of course, to refugees, as people are inevitably going to be fleeing the areas of fighting. And in that, we've seen destabilize neighboring countries, or seen it contribute to a refugee crisis where you've got already 80 million people displaced. So the current trajectory is not good. It's not good for Ethiopia. It's not good for the Horn of Africa. It's not good for the displaced persons crisis around the world. And there's just no engagement from the U.S. I think what you need is the U.S. and the European Union, together with the African Union, to be pushing as hard as possible to have a ceasefire, to just stop the fighting. We're not going to resolve the issues right now. Stop the fighting, have a ceasefire, set up some kind of national dialogue internal to Ethiopia, where these questions about Tigray and its autonomy and its budget can at least be discussed diplomatically, and just try to get a pause button on this thing, because we're headed off a cliff in Ethiopia right now. And I think you see the U.S. obviously, Trump couldn't care less. We're consumed by our election. But I mean, you need the U.S. involved here, together with the European Union. We're trading partners, we're assistance partners, we're security partners with Ethiopia. We have some leverage there. The African Union is the right front organization for this. They're based in Ethiopia. They speak with the clout of the African continent. So I just think this requires a lot more diplomacy than we've seen thus far, a lot more U.S. engagement and, frankly, European engagement than we've seen thus far. And I don't think that's going to happen until January 20th. So this, like some other things that we're seeing around the world, we're kind of racing the clock here. Like, how much will this situation deteriorate before a U.S. administration gets in there that might actually apply prioritization and diplomacy to this?
Yeah, I saw right before we started recording that, Pompeo had put out a statement from Turkey where he'd met with some like Orthodox Christian leader, which is just exactly what your Secretary of State should be doing if they're preparing to, for diplomacy with an Iowa caucus run with evangelicals in 2024 and ignoring like the massive problems that need actual diplomacy.
He's going to a West Bank settlement.
He's going to a vineyard.
He's literally visiting a winery in a settlement. He's going to the Golan Heights to spike the football over this annexation of territory. I mean, this is insane given all the pots boiling over around the world. This guy's on a tour doing his domestic politics with evangelical Christians and the right-wing Jewish community in this country. Like, this is insane given what's happening. John Kerry would be raising this issue at the UN. He'd be, consulting with African leaders. We'd be trying to get a diplomatic process. A ceasefire you can usually get to pretty fast, at least for a limited period of time, to see if you can negotiate something in that period of time. None of that is happening right now in Ethiopia, just like it didn't happen between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These are not world wars, but they're not small wars either. These are pretty significant kind of medium-sized conflicts that are going unaddressed.
Yeah, and they're existential for the people fighting. Yeah, I mean, look, Pompeo. I love Pompeo running around talking about religious freedom, knowing damn well that his boss told Xi Jinping that, building concentration camps for millions of Muslim Uyghurs in China was the right thing to do and to go forward. He's just completely morally bankrupt and full of shit. But let's talk about Al-Qaeda. So on Sunday, the New York Times reported that Al-Qaeda's second highest ranking leader and one of its founding members, a guy who was one of the masterminds of the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, was killed in Iran 3 months ago by Israeli-linked or maybe run assassins in Tehran. That's the reporting. His name is Abu Muhammad al-Masri. This assassination was reportedly carried out at the behest of the United States and was done on August 7th, which is the anniversary of the African embassy bombings. So we don't have any intel, Ben. It's hard to know exactly what this means for like the strength of Al-Qaeda itself. But it's worth noting that al-Masri was seen as like a very capable operational leader. He was there from the beginning. Our former colleague and a top intel official, Nick Rasmussen, said in the piece that his death will contribute to the fragmentation of the organization and splintering between like old guard and new guard, which seems reasonable. This has understandably, I think, kicked up a broader set of questions about why an Al-Qaeda guy was in Iran and what their links are or are not. Historically, this discussion has created some challenges, right? We remember the Bush administration attempting to connect Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein and using that to sell the war in Iraq. Do you want to offer any context about Iran and their ties with some of these like Sunni militant groups like Al-Qaeda and why these goons might be in Iran? And were you surprised by this story? I mean, hearing about, Israeli assassins or Israeli-linked assassins on motorcycles in Tehran, shooting at an Al-Qaeda guy with pistols. That was, kind of a vivid story.
Yeah, I mean, it's something out of a movie. There are two pieces. So first the Al-Qaeda Iran piece and then this operation. I mean, this has been a very strange dynamic dating all the way back to the Bush administration, where there were several fairly senior Al-Qaeda guys that were known to be in Iran. And in the years after 9/11, Iran put a bunch of these people in prison. Some of them were under house arrest. And there was this kind of strange dynamic, again, Bush, Obama, Trump, where you had these guys that were seen as former Al-Qaeda management types who were in Iran, but there wasn't an assessment that they were still operational, that they were playing any leadership role, that the Iranians don't share objectives with Al-Qaeda. I mean, they're the Iranians are Shia, Al-Qaeda is a Sunni extremist organization. They're on opposite sides of a variety of conflicts, including in places like Syria, including in Iraq. So I think there was this kind of perception that the Iranians were basically sitting on these guys. And yeah, some had been in prison, some had been under house arrest, but I'm not up to date, obviously. There's been 4 years under Trump of what's happened to these guys. But so that's the dynamic. It's not Iran actively supporting Al-Qaeda or providing some safe haven. It's that they rolled up the Al-Qaeda guys who were in the country after 9/11 and then just kind of sat on them, was basically the impression that existed, again, through the Bush years and Obama years and Trump years. This operation raised a lot of questions to me. I mean, on the one hand, this guy clearly is Al-Qaeda and clearly has blood on his hands. Although usually the U.S., usually there's an operational reason that you would take somebody out. In other words, usually it's because we have intelligence that this person is back involved in plotting terrorist attacks. So the biggest question I have is, was this like a retribution case of taking this guy out because of his role in the embassy bombings? Or do we think that he or other Al-Qaeda operatives in Iran have somehow, become activated? And there was no real clarity on that. This is a different kind of operation. I mean, I think people are accustomed to drone strikes against Al-Qaeda camps or Al-Qaeda leaders, but working, again, if the story is right, working through Israelis and their proxies inside of Iran to essentially assassinate a guy is just a very different flavor of a CT operation. We've seen the Israelis do this in the past in Iran and other places, take out targets through proxies, through gunmen who can carry out this kind of action. So to me, it raised a lot of questions, and some of them are, as much as you don't shed a tear for any guy like this, I'm just curious to know what the triggering factor was. Again, was it just we figured out where he was and he's a bad guy and he's responsible for the embassy? You can mount a defense on that. I'd just like to know, is it that, or is it because we think that this guy was somehow engaged in Al-Qaeda operations today from inside of Iran? That's a whole other ballgame. It'd be useful if Joe Biden and his team could get national security briefings to get the answers to that questions.
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of have a retribution vibe, given that the assassination happened on the anniversary of the embassy bombings. And it does sound like, various intel agencies have known that he's been in Tehran living with impunity for a long time. Yeah, I mean, the role of the Israeli sort of assassins did not surprise me, because I've read Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First, which talks about their use of, motorcycle gunmen and or bomb placers on a variety of officials, including scientists, which we should talk about the morality of that someday. But yeah, it was quite a story. I do think that Joe Biden should be briefed on these things. You're right, because you could see some sort of response or retribution, and we need to be ready for that. We
need to know why. And again, if we'd known he's in Iran for years and we just decided to assassinate him on the anniversary of those bombings, that's just a different kind of policy. That's and again, you could defend it on the basis of his guilt for that, but still, it's what kind of consequences will that bring? I mean, I just don't know enough to know why this operation happened, where it did, when it did, through the proxies that it did. To me, it raises more questions than it answers things.
Yeah, you and me both. Let's turn to Peru, because on Sunday, Peru's interim president, a guy named Manuel Merino, stepped down after only 6 days on the job. He did half a Scaramucci. He had come to power after Peru's legislature voted to remove the incumbent president, Martin Vizcarra. So Merino's 6-day term led to massive protests, marches all across Peru, mass resignations from the cabinet. Now, according to the Associated Press, it seems like a guy named Francisco Sagasti, who's a 76-year-old engineer and seen as a centrist sort of consensus pick, he will become Peru's third president in a week, because basically they'll make him head of the legislature, and then de facto that person becomes president. Sagasti and his party were among the few lawmakers to vote against removing the first president in the first place. And I think the key to understanding this whole mess seems to be political corruption. The AP story noted that every living former president of Peru has been accused or charged with corruption, and that half of Peru's Congress is under investigation for crimes that range from money laundering to homicide. So it's pretty intense. So these legislators are the ones who voted to remove the original president. They seemingly were worried because he was attempting to crack down on corruption and graft. So hopefully this will be the end of an acute political crisis for Peru, which is dealing with the world's highest per capita COVID mortality rate, massive economic inequality, a massive hit from the coronavirus, and corruption that is basically undercutting democracy itself. Ben, it seems like we've talked like once a month about this kind of mix, right? You have economic inequality, you have corruption, protests. Hopefully this outcome is durable and good for the people of Peru. But, I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about this situation. It's sort of happening in real time.
Well, I think what you've seen in Peru is reminiscent of what we've seen in Chile, where you had, protests about corruption, protests about inequality, young people fed up and taking to the streets. And there was plenty of corruption. You lift up a rock in Peru and it looks like underneath it, you find hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes to a politician. I think, though, what this reveals is that this is like a crisis in governance across the Americas, where you see this repeated pattern of massive government corruption scandals. We've seen in Brazil, we've seen in Chile, we've seen in Argentina, we've seen in Peru, and other countries, combined with massive frustration with inequality and with things getting worse, compounded by COVID. The part of the world that has been hammered the hardest by COVID is our hemisphere, from the United States on down. And so, to me, it suggests that the kind of myopic focus on Venezuela as the totality of our Latin America policy under this administration. We didn't even get into Bolivia, right, where you had this kind of bizarre right-wing effort to invalidate the election result that favored Evo Morales, and then the left winning in the recent elections. It suggests to me that there needs to be a kind of comprehensive look at what can the U.S. do together with the nations of the hemisphere. So we're in a glass house too when it comes to corruption, to fight corruption and to work cooperatively. Yeah, exactly. So this is not a case where I'm suggesting the U.S. kind of go down and tell people what to do. I'm saying, can we work together as a hemisphere to try to root out corruption, to try to crack down on illicit financial flows, to try to crack down on dirty money that washes around and finds its way into politicians' pockets, to strengthen democratic norms inside of our countries, and to not do so through the kind of ideological prism that Trump had, which is if you're right of center, you're good, and if you're left of center, you're bad. No, I don't care if you're right, left, or center. Like, let's start from the premise that you shouldn't be corrupt and that, we should be trying to work together to strengthen democratic institutions. Because I do feel like you're going to see this continue to migrate from country to country. And it's right that people are fed up with inequality. It's right that people are fed up with corruption. So let's come up with some policy tools to respond to that.
Yeah. Speaking of global cooperation, China and more than a dozen countries in the Asia-Pacific region signed a big free trade deal that spans roughly 30% of the world's population, roughly 28% of global trade. The countries who signed it said it would eliminate tariffs and quotas on about 65% of all goods that are traded in the region. Ben, I don't know why, but this feels familiar to me. It seems a bit like something we might have worked on in the past. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which Obama negotiated and Trump withdrew from in 2017, although admittedly Hillary Clinton had already walked away from it during the campaign. So do you know what happened here? Did the Chinese pick up the proposal that the U.S. fumbled and just run it 5 more yards over into the end zone? Or did this thing materially change a lot? What did you make of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP? I don't even know how to say it.
Yeah. No, I think, and look, I recognize that we criticize Trump a lot. We have a few more weeks to do so. I'm going to do here. I think the Chinese saw a huge opportunity. And we had negotiated over many years TPP, which is a similarly large block of nations, from Japan to Mexico and Canada to Singapore to Vietnam, 11 countries in TPP, to set rules of the road for trade that were largely developed by the United States. And by the way, also had protections for the environment, had protections for labor rights inside of countries. To get TPP done, a lot of these countries like Vietnam and Malaysia had to pass the most liberal labor laws through their parliaments that they'd ever passed before. And after painstakingly negotiating this, Trump just pulls out of it like on his first day in office. And I think Hillary would have come back into TPP. I think she would have asked for changes. She would ask for improvements. But the objective, I think, would have been to keep this in place. Because this wasn't just a trading bloc. It was an effort to say, this essentially is our team. These are the countries that agree with us on how intellectual property should be protected, how the environment should be protected, so that when we negotiate these issues with China, we're doing that multilaterally. It's not just the U.S. and China in a bilateral negotiation. It's the U.S. and those TPP countries negotiating these issues with China. And I think the opportunity the Chinese saw when the U.S. withdrew is the U.S. is out of the business of trade agreements. They're in a trade war with us. They're in, frankly, trade wars with lots of countries. We slapped tariffs on Japan. We slapped tariffs on South Korea. I think the Chinese went to these countries and said, hey, the Americans are now unpredictable. The Americans are the ones undermining global trade. Why don't you make a deal with us? And they basically just took that TPP model and expropriated it on their own terms, though. It's not the same deal. It's a deal that looks a lot more like how China would like trade to go. And it just shows you how much we lost 4 years under Trump. Not only did we lose TPP, but we lost the capacity to be the country driving how trade agreements are set and how rules are written. And I know a lot of people on the left don't like trade agreements. I get it. There needs to be better worker protections. It can't have all these get out of jail free cards for multinational corporations. But I say to you on the left, if we're not doing it, the Chinese are going to get in there and there's going to be no labor protections. There are going to be no environmental protections. So whether it's a traditional trade agreement or some other arrangements, the U.S. has to get back in the game of at least trying to set baselines with these other countries. The reality is that the Chinese have sped ahead of us from where we were 4 years ago because they saw the opportunity of Trump vacating this space.
Yeah. So listen, speaking of getting back in the game, because China's filling the space, we should talk about Hong Kong briefly, because last week the Chinese government passed a law that would allow the disqualification of lawmakers in Hong Kong who are deemed, quote, unpatriotic, end quote. So that, of course, means pro-democracy, pro-independence, pro-anything that China doesn't like. That law was immediately used by the Hong Kong government to disqualify 4 lawmakers. That disqualification led the remaining pro-democracy opposition, which was, I think, 15 legislators total, to resign en masse. And one of them said that this is officially the death of one country, 2 systems, and any semblance of independence for Hong Kong. Ben, I think Trump's national security advisor condemned this move, but as usual, Trump himself said absolutely nothing. My question is basically, do you think there's anything Biden or the international community can do to pressure China into walking this back at this point, especially now when the only tool that was available was protests, and those are basically impossible because of COVID restrictions? Or is it, do we feel like it's officially too late here?
I mean, I think in terms of one country, 2 systems, it's pretty clear that the Chinese Communist Party is basically putting an end to that. And I think what the democracy camp is doing now is kind of regrouping, that for a while they're trying to work within the system. They're trying to win elections. They're trying to hold levers of power inside of Hong Kong and then mobilize people on the streets when they had that opportunity. When the pandemic happened and you could no longer mobilize mass protests, they lost their biggest piece of leverage. At the same time that the Chinese government, recognizing that the U.S. didn't really care about this set of issues, certainly Trump didn't, and that the world was focused on other things, they just started ramming through all these laws and wrapping their arms around Hong Kong and squeezing as tight as they could. And so the pro-democracy camp is going to regroup here, and that involves leaving the government, so choosing to not legitimize a government that is clearly rigged against them and systems that are rigged against them. And internationally, I think that essentially we have to do a few things. Like, one is, if there's anybody who's at risk of persecution in Hong Kong, they should be welcome here in the United States, just as they're welcome in Britain. And I think other countries can follow suit. Like, there just has to be safe haven for people who fear for their safety or fear detention in Hong Kong under Chinese authorities. Second, I think we should remain diplomatically focused on this. And there's legislation that we've talked about that does everything from, restricting the capacity of U.S. or other international companies in Hong Kong to censor the free speech of their own employees, or to kind of kowtow to anti-democratic moves by the Chinese authorities there. And then also this question of, does Hong Kong get a special status that it currently enjoys if it's just going to be swallowed up by China? The cost of transactions, the U.S. financial regulations and laws are applied in such a way that it's easier to do business in Hong Kong. Well, you start leveraging that to try to reopen some space for people in Hong Kong. And then I think what the pro-democracy camp does is they regroup and they think about when is their next move. And is their next move more protest and mass mobilization when that becomes available, when there's a triggering event? Do they try to figure out how to re-enter politics in Hong Kong? Or are they kind of going into some form of exile and waiting for the international dynamic to change, waiting for the support that they can get from the international community to grow, waiting for some change within China? That's the space we're in. But I don't think that Biden should take his eye off this. I think we should continue to show that there's going to be a cost to China, and frankly, a cost to those who are doing business in Hong Kong, if suddenly Hong Kong's not really a one country's two system dynamic.
Yeah. So last thing, just a little bit of transition news. So we're recording this on Tuesday, November 17th. There have been a bunch of White House staff announcements. There haven't been any foreign policy positions announced yet. Biden had a meeting today with some sort of like foreign policy honchos that we could talk about if you want. But, there is some concern from progressives mostly that Biden could be preemptively browbeaten by Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate into choosing a more moderate cabinet. We've sort of talked about this before. And I'm starting to see an interesting idea get it floated about ways to get around that by using either recess appointments or the Vacancies Act. So I am far from an expert on this, but here's sort of how it could go. So let's say you put forward your Secretary of State nominee. That's a big progressive. McConnell fights it, votes it down, blocks it. Biden could then take that person, make them like a senior advisor at state, I think like wait 90 days, and then use the Vacancies Act to make them acting secretary. And some experts say that person could then serve in that role for about 2 years and basically just have the job as Trump did countless times. Or Biden could use a recess appointment to name his cabinet. You could, a recess appointment, for those who don't know, occurs when the Senate is in recess and the president needs to fill a role that requires confirmation, but the Senate is not around, so you use your authority to make a temporary pick. The problem now is that Congress tries to prevent recess appointments from ever happening. So Biden would have to use the authority he has to adjourn Congress, like forcibly, and then make the appointment. So this is a little confusing. I'm so far from an expert on the details, but I guess philosophically, I wonder if Biden needs to threaten to do some of these things to help keep McConnell from going full obstructionist. So you at least know that like you have a lever here. Or maybe that's naive to begin with. I don't know. How are you thinking about this, Ben? And again, I don't want to get ahead of the Biden people. Like, I'm interested to see who they pick, and I think we should let them pick the right people on the merits. But I do hate this idea that McConnell could somehow dictate who's in Joe Biden's cabinet. Fuck that guy.
Yeah, and again, I don't know how the Biden people are thinking about these questions, so we're speaking for ourselves here. But I think that the way the Republicans have abused this system and created two sets of rules, one for Republican presidents and one for Democratic presidents, mandates that you play hardball. And look, in an ideal world, we're all abiding by the oldest agreed upon set of rules and norms. But for a couple of decades, there's been one set of rules that apply to Republican presidents, another to Democrats, and we just shouldn't accept that anymore. And look, this comes into place in two ways with the Trump people. I mean, more than two, but two I'll highlight. One is some totally fucking crazy people got confirmed for jobs. Like Rick Grinnell was confirmed to be the ambassador to Germany. I mean, he's just a troll.
He's a clown. He's a clown.
Ratcliffe, complete and utter fucking hack, was confirmed to be the director of national intelligence. And guess what he did after that? He was a complete and utter fucking hack. Never mind all the acting secretaries and undersecretaries and deputy secretary. We've got acting Chad Frat Paddle,
acting Chad,
JV fascist over at DHS. He's made a mockery of this process, and so the idea that after Trump has made a mockery of both who is confirmed by Mitch McConnell's Senate and who he just kind of rams in there when even those people couldn't be confirmed by Mitch McConnell's Senate, the idea that Mitch McConnell can then turn around and say, well, we don't like, this person or that person to be in your cabinet. So here's the agreed upon list, that you can choose from for your cabinet. That is insane. And there's no reason that Joe Biden should accept that. He should pick exactly who he wants to be in his cabinet. And if Mitch McConnell's messing around, then you find a way to go through him or around him. I'm sorry, this is it. We don't have time for this nonsense. There's a pandemic. No, we really don't. There are all these crises around the world. There's a collapse in American standing. There's a global economic crisis. We can't sit around here and wait for Mitch McConnell to puff out the white smoke for the moderate to conservative appointees that he will tolerate. That's insane. Joe Biden won this election. He should have his cabinet. And look, if he appoints someone who's so egregious that their nomination unravels, that's one thing. But if he appoints someone who's clearly qualified, and Mitch McConnell and all these extremists in the Republican Party just don't like them for some partisan reason, then you find a way to get that person in the job.
Yeah, the system was not designed to give the opposition Senate Majority Leader a veto on the president's cabinet. Historically, you almost never vote against nominees unless they are, as you said, unqualified. Your political opponents are going to choose their allies to serve in their cabinet. You should not get a say in it. I don't want to hear a word about bipartisanship or comity or respect for institutions. If Mitch McConnell didn't have any respect for the Senate he led and let Donald Trump go around him time after time after time to put acting unqualified monsters in charge just because he wanted to avoid a hearing that might have been embarrassed, even when they would have gotten through, they just wanted to avoid embarrassing votes. It's a joke. Then Joe Biden should do whatever it takes to get the people he needs in place, period.
Yeah, this is not about polarization. Polarization is about Mitch McConnell not even allowing hearings on a Supreme Court justice, or the current president of the United States not even recognizing that he fucking lost the election. That's polarization. This is about the need to get people in the jobs. And this isn't about bipartisanship because Joe Biden is the most bipartisan human that could possibly be elected president of the United States today. The people he's going to nominate are not going to be far left extremists. They're not even going to be as progressive as I would probably like, It's just going to be that Mitch McConnell doesn't like certain Democrats, or Mitch McConnell wants to throw his power around. And frankly, the way it would have worked in the past is these people would at least come to a vote, and if someone was qualified, you'd probably get a handful of Republican votes. What this is about is if Mitch McConnell is the leader, and by the way, we should all donate, work our butts off for Georgia. We won't have to have this conversation. But if Mitch McConnell is the leader, this is about Mitch McConnell saying, I will block this person from even getting a vote. I won't let this person, move forward and advance through the Senate. And, that's just not how things should work. It's not how our democracy, this is someone using the tools of democracy in incredibly undemocratic means, right? To put himself above the president of the United States in the selection of the cabinet. And I just think Biden should not humor this in the slightest.
Totally agree. Thanks to you, Ben, for, talking to me.
Yeah,
I need friends these days. I feel more isolated than ever thanks to this god-awful virus. So here we are.
This is the longest conversation that I have all week, I think. And again, we've got to it's so weird to feel the gravity shifting from Trump to these Biden people. I think what we'll have in the coming weeks, though, is we'll start to have appointments and nominations, and that'll be
awesome.
That'll be fun to talk about, because then we won't just be talking about Trump burning things down on the way out. We'll be talking about at least who's going to try to rebuild from the burned out foundation.
Amen. So next week, we are doing a mailbag. If you have questions, hit us up on social media. We're recording this week so that we both can do the Thanksgiving thing and be off next week after a long 4 years. But we really look forward to the mailbag episodes. Actually, some of my favorite ones. We get great questions. So talk to y'all soon.